Hello and welcome to our episode. This is Straying from the Path in Youth Mental Health. And today we're going to be shedding some light on the limitations of psychiatric labels and honoring the complexity of young people's lives and explore the power of shifting to intentional person-first human experience language. This episode is really a call to action for those dedicated to supporting youth, as well as themselves, to challenge convention and to embrace the stories and narratives of young people in their words. And we're just so grateful that you're listening. And before we dive in deeper, I figure it might be worth introducing ourselves in this space. I am not alone. So Max, would you like to go first?
Sure. So I am Max. I use they, them, or he, him pronouns. I use that interchangeably. I have been with Youth Move National, which is where I am partnering from today. And I am currently the board president amongst a million other hats that I wear in my spaces in this space. I am a young adult with lived experience of trauma. I am also autistic, queer, and trans.
Thank you, Max. And who am I? My name is Shayn McDonald. My pronouns are they, them, and theirs. I will share that I am coming to y'all under settler colonialism from Massachusetts. If it's okay with you, Max, just noting that we are from the same geographic location. I am also a person of many lived and living experiences and identities. And for the sake of our topic today, I will share that some words that I use and that I identify with are that I am trans and agender. Queer is also great too. Neurodivergent, autistic, and I am also someone who is myself a suicide attempt and a trauma survivor. So with all of that being said, again, our focus really today is to dive deeper into the language and narratives traditionally used in the realm of mental health, quote unquote, and try to explore a shift in paradigm in language towards, again, what we call person-first human experience language. Max and I both joined this space speaking from both our lived and professional experience. That might be a good place for us to start, maybe, right? On how we sort of entered this journey of language paradigm shifting from our lived experience.
I came into kind of the mental health world at just 3 years old, which is traumatic in itself. I have an experience of like being neurodivergent, being autistic, being, mislabeled as a child. I started on psychiatric medication very, very young at that 3-year-old mark. And a lot of that influenced my childhood, as well as the trauma influenced my childhood. I think that when I became a teenager, more and more I was like, I'm not quite sure all of these labels that were given to me are accurate or reflective of me as a person and as a whole. And it felt very reductive. And it was constantly like, no, well, this is what you are. And I'm like, but I'm telling you, this isn't what I am. And if I don't know who I am, how do you know who I am? I started kind of digging into that and exploring it. And the more that I was like, oh, I'm actually traumatized, and I had, I'm an abuse survivor, and I grew up, not being safe anywhere. And so that obviously reflected into my behavior and the ways that I felt as a child and teenager. I, as well as Shayn had mentioned for themselves, am also a suicide attempt survivor multiple times over. And, looking back at my childhood, I'm like, okay, I can pinpoint why. I felt that way. And it's not because I'm mentally ill. It's because I was steeped in abuse from a very, very young age. And that experience obviously heavily influenced who I am, how I behave, and how I feel about the world in general. And yeah, the people like Shayn, folks in my life now, it's very much like, okay, so we can understand who you are under this context. And it's given me a space to, be myself and not feel like I have to label every single thing that I am. And I can just be like, yeah, like all of this makes sense. All of this is completely logical. And I was honestly, in a lot of ways, failed by the mental health system my entire life. And it was really finding peer support and folks who have been through similar experiences where I was really able to name my experiences in my own words without people telling me that that's not my experience, which was really, really great.
And I resonate with that so deeply. Similar journey for myself. Ever since I was a little kid, I always felt like I was on the outside of things and just generally operated in a different way. And I've always had that lens of curiosity on really wanting to dig into social rules and roles and the ways people understand and interpret the human experience. And I generally just really struggled in resonating with that in those narratives, experiences of others, and felt like, and realize this now more than ever that this was the case for me. But even when I was younger, feeling like I was trying to assimilate or adapt in ways that I didn't actually feel good or true about. For myself, right? Especially when I started struggling in my mind, which really came to a head for me in early high school. And I will say that I'm someone who experienced trauma across my life in ways that weren't fully acknowledged or recognized by those around me, even by myself. And so I really, at this peak point of my life where I was really struggling, leaned on the psychiatric labels or diagnoses that were placed on me because, of course, when I did start struggling, my first idea was to lean on the mental health system and seek out psychiatry and these labels and approaches, right? And again, I leaned on these labels really to defend the validity of my experiences, but ultimately didn't really find a whole lot of affirmation or healing or liberation through those labels. It was really only when, and this is, again, I really resonate with your experience too, Max. It was really only when the context of my life was considered and held without judgment or clinical interpretations from others with firsthand lived experience, right? My peers, so entering that realm of peer support. And when I became aware of the psychiatric survivor movement, which we'll get into a little bit more, right? And that's when I really fully understood my rights to reassess, reinterpret, and redefine all of my experiences, past and present, for myself. And now I really just do everything in my power to ensure that every person understands that they have that right too, right? And just in general, for other folks, projecting and exclusively deferring to these clinical and psychiatric labels and diagnoses really can reduce people down to certain boxes, categorizations, diagnoses, right? Really kind of taking away from their individuality, humanity, and autonomy, and naming and defining what they're experiencing for themselves, right? And not everybody identifies with these labels that are being given to them, right? And that's another piece of this conversation. These diagnostic labels, these psychiatric labels, everything within our diagnostic and statistical manual, right, our DSM, is all founded based on a Western biomedical model and understanding framework for mental health. And that is not the only way to interpret and understand these things. And that is, for me, at least, like at the heart of this conversation, is the value of honoring that right to really reinterpret and redefine all of our experiences for ourselves.
Growing up and like having all these things placed on you and then feeling like, okay, things are being said about me that don't resonate and they don't hit for me. And for me, growing up, like, it very much felt like a performance, and that I was kind of like a marionette that was kind of like, hey, like, this is what you're experiencing, no matter how many times I was like, that's actually not what I'm experiencing. And I think the outward perception of my experience was so muddled by the fact that nobody wanted to touch trauma as a concept. Nobody wanted, and I think a big part of that is, when you are a child, a lot of the times your parents are consistently in, at least for my experience. My mother is, I love my mother, big source of trauma for me. And she was always in my therapy appointments. So I couldn't talk about the trauma at home because my mother would do, the whataboutisms, changing the topic. And so instead of the person getting a full, well-rounded idea of what my life was like at home, that was never able to happen. Nor did people, even when I was alone in things like a neuropsych evaluation, conversations about trauma never really came up, or they were things that didn't resonate with me. a lot of the things that we go by, like the ACEs, don't recognize sibling abuse. They only recognize abuse from adults. They don't recognize bullying and abuse from peers, which was the majority of my childhood abuse was from my peers, and from adults that I don't know. And so when you have all of these experiences, like I wasn't hit as a kid, but like I was emotionally abused as a kid, a lot of this is like, okay, I don't fit into those boxes, but that is nonetheless very much traumatic. So I felt like I was slipping through a massive size crack that I know 1,000,001 other kids have fallen through. And so when I would go, it would be like, okay, but like your parents don't hit you. And I was like, okay, but like that can't be where the bar is, like that can't be. And I felt like it was just this constant, like, instead of, oh, maybe there's something going on that is making you behave this way, that is valid and reasonable, which, spoiler alert, there were. It was, okay, how can we shift this to you are sick, this is your fault and in your head, and we need to just medicate it and tuck it away. And for me, what I really realized when I got into peer support was when I started being able to be like, oh yeah, that was traumatic. Like I didn't say that I had trauma till I was 22 years old. I could not bring myself to acknowledge it because I was constantly being told that I wasn't traumatized, even though very clearly I was. And when I was 22, I remember one day just like completely breaking down, being like, yeah, I'm traumatized, and like listing out this huge list of trauma to one of my supports. And they just look at me and they go, I didn't know any of this. And like, nobody knows any of this because I don't talk about it, because every time I've tried to, it's been shut down. And I think the beauty of what peer support has done for me personally is like, it's not shut down. You get to talk about it. It's not like, oh, we're going to lock you up in a psychiatric unit for talking about your feelings. It's, hey, you actually behaved incredibly reasonably given the context of your life. And then it was kind of gave me that permission to be like, okay, like I have trauma. How much trauma do I have? And then obviously you go down the rabbit hole of, oh my goodness, my childhood trauma was a lot worse than I thought. But that also gives you a freedom of like, okay, I know it, I see it, I acknowledge it. I'm going to work with the inner child of myself, which very much is still there, very much got an inner child going on. And it really has given me that permission to like, once I stepped away from labels, I was able to be like, okay, I'm traumatized and I'm autistic. And those are the things that really framed what my childhood and teenage years were. And those were all reasonable responses to that experience. Instead of, oh, I'm sick and there's something wrong with me. It's like, no, something happened to me and something impacted me that made me feel like I had no other choices.
Yeah, I really resonate with what you just shared. I'm somebody that identifies as a lifelong gaslighting survivor. Growing up, I was always told that my life was great family-wise by my family. And similar to you, right? Like there are certain circumstances where if you name them, that automatically generate validation, affirmations, and like support, right? And then there are other experiences that are often unaffirmed or not acknowledged or honored and respected in a similar way. And for me, there was a lot of like gray area in terms of what was going on for me. And a lot of it was very nuanced, right? Like this gaslighting. I grew up fully developing this assumption that I could not trust anything that I thought or believed about myself or anything else around me. And so I very much leaned on those narratives, definitions, and ways of approaching things from other people. I also experienced all sorts of other trauma growing up, including grooming by a teacher for the majority of my like K through 12 school experience. And this was something that I did not realize was trauma or abuse. And then when I did feel like something was wrong, I brought it up. I was invalidated both by my family and the school and everybody around me. So I just kind of grew up thinking, all right, well, there's clearly nothing wrong with my context and lived experience. So what's wrong with me, right, is what I deferred to. And I remember one particular experience in high school where I was sitting in the car with my dad, and he looked over at me and he said something along the lines of, you have a plate in front of you and a roof over your head every day. Why are you so sad? And the only thing I could lean on in that moment was, well, Dad, I'm sick. I'm sick. There is something wrong with my brain and I am sick. And his response to that, verbally and non-verbally, was so kind and affirming. It was like there was a complete shift in 180, right? And so I felt in that moment like, okay, that's the way I'm going to get support and validation, by naming this experience of being in my mind and body in this way. I had no idea at that time that there were other ways of interpreting that experience. And again, even in that moment, didn't really fully understand the level in which I had experienced trauma. And these were experiences that when I entered these peer support, lived experience led and run spaces, I named these experiences again and instantly got them validated. I didn't even know the word grooming existed. I shared that experience one time with a former colleague in peer support, and they immediately said, oh yeah, that's grooming. And it was just profound for me as a moment in my life to say, oh my goodness, so this is real. I am valid, right? And it also, again, like continued to open me up to this idea of maybe some of these labels and ways of understanding my experience from other folks and people and the world outside of me aren't right for me. And I loved what you said about finding your inner child too. That's something I deeply resonate with. And for me, finding my inner child is me returning to and refinding, exploring my authentic self beyond the conditioning that I've experienced growing up, and all these preconceived notions that I had absorbed and woven into the fabric of who I am around who I am and what I'm doing here, and what my experiences are. So I really, really appreciate that.
Yeah, and I super resonate with the gaslighting experience without going into too much context, because again, it is traumatizing. I grew up in an extremely emotionally volatile home. My brother was extremely abusive in pretty much every capacity you can imagine abuse being in. You know, my parents were also terrified of him because he was strong and had a temper like you would not believe. And instead of protecting me, it was very much everybody for themselves. Because they were also scared. And while I'm like, as an adult, I'm like, okay, I can acknowledge this was also traumatizing for my parents. And I was a child and they were the adults and I was not protected. It's also looking back at like how many people kind of knew and didn't do anything. I remember like my after school program would go an hour out of their way to drop me off home last on Tuesdays because they knew that my mom didn't get home till late and they were scared of my brother. And I'm like, okay, so nobody did anything, though. You didn't do anything of any real measure. You just dropped me home a little bit late and never really brought it up. And kind of watching that happen, and also like having to become, and big part of why I do the inner child healing is I had to become an adult very, very early. I had to be basically my mother's therapist from the age of like 4. Because when my brother wasn't targeting me, he was typically targeting my mother. And my dad didn't know how to handle it. Loved my dad, but he had no idea what to do. And from a very early age, it was like, okay, I've got to support mom. And I've got to be a caregiver. And I cannot take care of myself because everybody else needs to be taken care of. And I think that that's a part of the emotional abuse that I'm still unlearning of like, I don't have to take care of everyone all the time. And I still definitely have that like Papa Bear energy of like, I need to just caregive for everyone. And I remember just like growing up in that environment. And like the only times I was ever validated or praised were for taking care of other people. And that very much comes, and I noted it when I started doing like getting services for mental health. Like I didn't actually get to utilize those services because all of the adults, whether or not they were cognizant of it at the time, were like, oh, you're easily manipulated because you were emotionally abused. We're making you a role model and basically an unpaid staff member. And instead of being able to be a child and make mistakes that other children were allowed to make, I was vilified for the smallest mistake because I was the role model where I did not ask for that. I'm supposed to be here to be getting support, but now you're basically making me work for you. And I know that's not a unique experience. I've talked to a lot of folks who are like, yeah, I never got to utilize those experiences because they just basically made me a staff member because they just clocked immediately that I was a caregiver and was easily manipulated to do so. not only did the supports I did get not work, most of the supports I didn't even get them the way that other kids were getting them because I was just deemed a role model and then I had to work. Basically was forced to volunteer with multiple places without any consent on my part. I don't think anyone knew how bad my home life was. I don't think truly anyone could comprehend that unless they're in it. But one of the most validating experiences has been most of my friends work in peer support in some capacity. And some of them have met, including Shayn, you as well, have met my brother, and the immediate validation of like, oh my God, like if I only saw that much, how much is there that's happening when I'm not there? Because he doesn't really care. So it was very validating to have multiple people now in my adulthood who are like, oh yeah, that's awful. And if it was that awful when I was present, what was your childhood like? And I'm like 100 times worse. And that's been a really validating experience. But yeah, like the being emotionally abused and easily manipulated, and then like becoming a caretaker. And I remember like people being like, oh, you know, you're really kind and compassionate, but your brother's the smart one. And I was like, all right, first of all, why do we have to do that? That doesn't seem fair. And it also makes me feel like you're calling me stupid, which also does not feel good, feels very ableist and gross. I don't think smartness is the gauge of whether or not you should abuse people. So like growing up, it was like, okay, you want me to be a caregiver? Let me absolutely destroy my own life to take care of you. And that's something that still absolutely, like, I still go into conversations with my mom being like, okay, I gotta stop. I gotta step out of this conversation. So I definitely resonate with like the emotional abuse, and like I was the perfect victim in so many ways for a lot of folks. But when I say perfect victim, I mean like that in their eyes. And just, yeah, coming to peer support and having all of that validated, it was definitely a moment for me.
What you just shared in so many ways too signifies like a shifting, like this greater shifting that we're really getting at the heart of this conversation too, right? Totally understanding that, you know, when, and we're fairly young still, right? But when we were little conversations around mental health and trauma were very different. I do experience personally and professionally this shift around we need to talk about mental health and we need to acknowledge trauma, right? And while I appreciate that shift to making these conversations more mainstream, quote unquote, and normalized and encouraged across spaces and ages and contexts and things, there is an intention around this shift that I am also experiencing personally and professionally that we are moving away from or gravitating towards, which is this focus exclusively on this clinical interpretation of our lived experiences and just understanding experiences under the umbrella of quote unquote mental health, right? That might be a good segue for us to kind of lean into this shift in this conversation, right? Around how we came about this new framework of interpreting language, maybe sharing a little bit about where that came from. And definitely, I want to give a little bit of a spiel. I'm sure you could do justice to that for sure, Max, around the psychiatric survivor movement and the role that grassroots social justice movement has and continues to play in that shifting conversation. Before we jump into too much of how we came about this shift in language and this new framework, the roots of it, right? It might be worth actually defining what we mean by this person first human experience language. So for folks who may be new to this concept or this way of approaching intention around language, person first human experience language is made up of two pieces, right? So the first is that it's person first. So person first language always puts the person first in this sense of the youth sphere and mental health, right? Quote unquote. It centers the idea that a young person is a whole person separate from whatever labels may have been placed on them. For example, if I were to put this in a sentence, youth and young adults who have firsthand experience with psychiatric diagnoses and or trauma deserve self-determined resources and supports. This sentence is considered person first, right? Because youth and young adults is separate from the parts of the sentence that refer to their specific experience or those labels that they may have been given, versus something like all clients are invited to participate in our upcoming self-care workshop. A little bit of a funkier example, right? But this sentence is not considered person first because rather than putting a label before naming the person or acknowledging their humanity is completely left out. And instead, it's referring to people as clients, which is not separate from those words to describe who they are as people. The client in this example refers to specific people and identifies them as people receiving mental health services all at the same time. And the whole idea is to separate both pieces, right? Because the person having the living experience and the ways that they identify and interpret and define for themselves is separate from all of those labels and interpretations outside of them. And then the second piece of this language is that it's non-clinical, everyday human language, right? Language that we would typically use in our everyday lives outside of clinical or system-specific language and terminology. And this, again, and we'll continue to emphasize this, allows young people and all people to understand their right to, as I said, reassess, reinterpret, and redefine those experiences, and creates opportunities for choices in how their lives and experiences are understood, approached, supported. And it's a reclaiming. It's an autonomy reclaiming, right? It's a reclaiming of power and self-determination that we should have in our own lives, and we promote across these youth-serving systems and services. That is the long and short of what person-first human experience language is. And I mean, Max, anything else that you want to add to that? Otherwise, I'd love to hear how you came about this framework, both personally and professionally.
I will just note for our listeners that there are kind of exceptions to what we call person-first language. The two that come to mind, because it's my own lived experiences, are disabled and autistic. At large, the disabled community prefers the term disabled, like they'll say like they are disabled and not a person with a disability, because we have really worked hard to destigmatize the term disabled. Now, there are absolutely some folks within that community, of course, we're not a monolith, who do choose to say they are a person with disabilities. But for the most part, as a community at large, we like disabled people, disabled person as our typical language. And the same thing goes for the autistic community. I know a lot of people grew up being told it's people with autism, but that language was largely decided by social workers and not by actual autistic people. And again, there are absolutely people who prefer the term person with autism. And if that is someone that you work with or know, absolutely defer to the language that they use to describe themselves. But overall, as communities, specifically those two, because those are where I can speak from, we do use disabled and autistic versus person with autism or person with disabilities. But again, that varies from person to person. So if it's an individual and you hear them use person with autism, use that word, use that language to describe them. It really is making sure, and part of person first is making sure you ask the person and see where they want that language to land, what they prefer and enjoy and mandate in certain cases. Yeah, I just wanted to make that disclaimer before getting into how I came to learn about all of it. It really is peer support is where I found it. I've been doing peer support since I was 17 years old. So that is 10, almost 11 years now. And didn't really learn about it till a few years into doing peer support when I found kind of the broader peer support community. Because let's be honest, I didn't know I was doing peer support when I started peer support. It wasn't called that, but it is what it was. And I remember the first time somebody was like, oh no, I don't use the term mentally ill. And I was like, okay, explain that to me. And I had like a whole conversation, and the whole mindset for them was like, I know where I've been. I know what I've been through. I know that my responses to those things were fair and reasonable and appropriate for the situation, despite folks on the outside not really understanding them. And I remember having a little bit of an existential crisis about that and being like, wait a minute, hold on. This is completely reshifting the way that I think about this. And more people that I met were like, oh, I'm mad, or I'm a psych survivor, or yeah, I don't identify with the DSM. I don't like the DSM. I know a lot of people now who have many criticisms with the DSM. I think that is expanding as a movement right now because of particular instances in the world that people are like, okay, we're pathologizing like normal human experiences, and that's not okay. I think one of the biggest shifts I've seen since discovering this has been when I can't remember if it was like 2020, 2021, the DSM was trying to include prolonged grief disorder as a mental illness. And a lot of people were very upset, rightfully so, because that is just a normal human experience. It is normal to grieve. You will grieve forever. That's kind of the whole point of grief is prolonged. You lose somebody, like, that's going to affect you for the rest of your life. And sure, it's not going to be the same the entire time, but it's like people really started to be like, wait a minute, that's normal though. Why are we? And then a lot of folks started being like, oh, we're pathologizing a lot of normal things. And it really opened up, I think, for a lot of folks. And I was already there by that point. Like, I already was in there, been there, done that, bought the t-shirt. But I very much was like, cool, all right, this is expanding and that's great, because we're starting to realize how much we pathologize normal reactions to tough situations.
100%. And I really appreciate that note around the nuances of utilizing this language in person first versus, folks who absolutely identify and name their experiences before their names, right? Like, I am someone who also identifies with the phrase, like, I am an autistic person, right? Really, and what came to mind as you were describing that is that idea of informed consent, right? It's that idea of having all of the different options and possibilities out there and described and outlined in front of you, but you also having the autonomy to choose what you align with and what you don't. And that may very well be those labels, diagnoses, narratives, and interpretations that have been given to you, placed on you, right? However, they may be different, and that is okay and equally valid and right. And that's really what I'm getting at in this conversation, right? So I appreciate that for sure. And I will say too, overall, this framework of person first human experience language is integral, like have to, as much as possible within peer support roles specifically. And that helps me share too. I came about this framework when I trained to be certified as a peer specialist, just generally in my state. But this is a framework that all people personally and professionally should use as much as possible and would benefit from. And for me, the way that I interpret my experiences is really kind of in two different ways, right? First, what I call my trauma-informed or context-informed, right? Ways of being and understanding myself, which historically has been interpreted through the lens of mental health and psychiatry and like mental illness, quote unquote, right? Versus the way my brain and mind operates naturally as an autistic and neurodivergent person, which is separate from, though absolutely informed by, my trauma and context. And I would not have been able to make those separations for myself or understand those two unique, but again, like interwoven facets of myself without exposure to this kind of language. And I will also say that, especially depending on the professional hat that you're wearing, if you're working within the realm of quote unquote mental health, there may be specific occasions when it makes sense to, or you have to refer to a young person's diagnoses or use that clinical language, right? And these may include times when a young person has asked you, if you're a peer and you're listening, right? A peer support to accompany them to a doctor's appointment, or, if you are working in a more clinical role and for documentation, billing purposes, accessing resources is a thing in terms of having certain diagnoses. You can obviously, as you need to, use that language. However, the idea is to refer to these diagnoses if and when you absolutely have to, but without reinforcing them, right? And you could even name it in a way where this person has been diagnosed or labeled with this, right? And still not necessarily combine them together in a way that isn't, at the very least, person first, right? This is very different from saying someone is or has a particular diagnosis. Saying someone has been diagnosed or labeled with something only refers to the fact that they were seen by someone who diagnosed them in that way, right? Not attempting to say that the diagnosis means anything or is making assumptions about that being true for them or something that they identify with specifically. Also important to note is at the roots of this too are what are the roots of our peer support workforce. We hear a lot about this peer support movement. There's a very important and integral difference and distinction between the workforce and the grassroots movement that the workforce emerged from. And I don't know if you want to kind of give a go first of what we mean by this psychiatric survivor movement, but I know you've described it in incredible ways, and I would love to hear you do that now if you'd like to, Max.
Yeah. The psych survivor movement was kind of formed as folks who were receiving services through psychiatry, therapy, etc. They kind of found themselves with a really unhealthy power dynamic between psychiatrists and folks. Like, the term you typically hear is patient. I don't like that term, but that is the clinical term that is constantly used. And they kind of found like, oh, like they have so much power over us, and there is so much labeling and force being used to kind of keep us in this mainstream ideal of behavior and experiences where we don't fit that behavior and experience. It really stemmed from people being kind of fed up with asylums, which realistically are still absolutely around, just rebranded. And folks were really tired of being literally tied up and overly medicated and knocked out. And really, psychiatrists still to this day have a lot of power. And I think it also goes back to the conversation of informed consent, which in the reality of experiences with like big pharma and our current experiences now and then, informed consent doesn't really exist in psychiatry still to this day, because we really don't know what the long-term effects of medication are going to look like for people. We don't really know what the meds we're giving people are doing. And a lot of people got really rightfully angry about it and decided, hey, we've had enough of this really unhealthy power dynamic you have over us. We're being medicated into silence. A lot of us are dying in these asylums and institutions. Where can we convene and talk about it and get angry and get mad? And that's really where the psych survivor movement stemmed from, is we want to take our power back. We want the power to lead our own lives and make our own decisions, which is, I think, an experience that is not unique to psych survivors. I think that is true of basically any huge rights movement. Is we want power back, we want autonomy, and how are we going to get it? We're going to make a stink about it. And I think also importantly, noting the context of it has always been a very dangerous game to speak out against psychiatry. It is always, people have utilized a lot of words and a lot of methods to silence folks who are critical of any system, in this case, the mental health system or the mental health industrial complex, and the ways in which that feeds into the prison industrial complex, and the way it feeds into poverty and domestic violence and abuses of power, and how this system is, regardless of, sure, there may be some good people in it, but the system itself is designated by a power dynamic and abuse of power and literally having control over other people. And it's really about giving people control back over their own lives and their own experiences, and giving them the ability to say, this is who I am. I'm self-determining this language for myself. And then that starts a pattern of, okay, now I can completely change my life because I have taken back that power that has been historically taken from me.
I appreciate you so much. I could absolutely go on a whole rabbit hole spiel and separate conversation around all of the nuances within that greater psych survivor movement. But I think that something that came to mind for me in the realm of peer support, which again emerged from that grassroots movement with a lot of kind of controversy within that even initial idea of doing that, right? Because ultimately it is folks who have been on the receiving end of harm by systems going back into these systems, and in some ways, whether or not identify with, resonate, or want to represent them, they are becoming parts of that system in their own way too. And so a lot of folks in the early days of this workforce becoming a thing, right, were really worried about all of these important sentiments and core values of this grassroots movement being being reinterpreted, misconstrued. A big word that is used within this movement and advocacy around it is co-optation, or being co-opted, right? So we absolutely have a peer support workforce, and we are constantly having those conversations around role clarity, best practices, and trying to streamline on like a large, broad scope level, the values and ethics around how we do this important work. And I think inspired by your response, those two pieces are really supporting people with returning to their power and autonomy in navigating services, resources, spaces for support in healing and moving through and beyond the experiences that they're struggling with, no matter how they name them. And then also this advocacy, this being a change agent and trying to shift paradigms, language, approaches, systems on a greater level too, right? And returning power to folks individually and collectively in that way as well. And ultimately, and this is, our last real piece of this conversation, is that this is, again, a call to action. This conversation should not end here for us as speakers to this conversation, and for you as a listener, right? Really at the heart of this, it is returning to centering our humanity in this work of supporting folks through trauma, emotional distress, life struggles, however you name and identify those things, no matter what roles that you're wearing or having, right? Like I said, with this worry about peer support and co-optation, as we as people enter these human service support fields, often we get sort of lost and assimilated to these rigid system narratives, language, approaches, understandings, right? And lose our connection to the humanity at the heart of all of this. We are all human beings on the planet, ideally trying to support each other and moving forward and finding ourselves in ways that feel good and true to us. And making this shift in language can seem a little simple, right? But has a profound impact on an individual to a collective level. And I will also say that this is an effort around decolonizing these systems, right? There's a lot of talk around decolonizing mental health, decolonizing these systems. And in a lot of cases, these are like system-led efforts to bring in folks with lived experience, folks who have been on the receiving end of systemic harm, and having their identities, language, approaches, practices, understandings, narratives colonized, being asked to come in and teach the ways of decolonization and returning to practices that have been around for years and years, pre-settler colonialism in this Western biomedical model, right? Like we hear mindfulness, we're talking about healing circles, right? And we're trying to weave that back into a, inherently colonizing framework that is rooted in so much injustice and ultimately still is mainly geared towards centering cisgender, heterosexual, white, European men. And that is absolutely not all of us.
Absolutely. And I think, too, something I want to note as somebody who does youth work, and I work with youth, I have a very strong feeling a lot of listeners also work with youth, that youth are in a very unique position. So both Shayn and I are adults. I would argue probably most of the folks listening are adults, but youth don't get to have the kind of autonomy that adults do. And obviously adults in this system still have a lack of autonomy. But I really want to note and specify that young adults have a very unique oppression placed upon them, because everybody just assumes the youth-based ageism, right? We assume that youth don't know who they are. We assume they don't know what we're talking about. And I really wanted to bring this call to action around to young people also know who they are. I knew who I was from a very, very young age. I was very, very open about that, whether that is about being traumatized, whether that is about being autistic, queer, trans. Young people know a lot more than we give them credit to, and they are the most impacted by lack of autonomy in these conversations. And I really want to note that and bring the fact that we can give youth more autonomy than they have. And as somebody who works with teenagers, they are brilliant and they know who they are and they are so aware. And I want us to ensure that we recognize their autonomy just as much as we'd recognize an adult's autonomy. I'm grateful for this conversation. I hope that folks take this. I hope folks listen to this with an open mind. I know there are going to be folks who have never heard some of this stuff before. I want to acknowledge that learning is uncomfortable. And I hope that folks were able to sit with some discomfort during this conversation if it came up for you. I hope that you are able to find the love and intention in it, because that really is what it's about. It's about caring and compassion and respecting each other and our differences and the ways we may be the same, and really getting down to we're all humans, we're all people, and we are all coming from unique and non-unique backgrounds. We're all living on the same planet. The world is an inherently traumatizing place, and kind of recognizing that everybody's going to have a different way to describe themselves. And I really want this to be a call for loving and compassion and open-mindedness. I want folks to keep their mind open, because I feel like being closed-minded is a deterrent to progress. And I'd love to see us get further into this conversation around autonomy, self-determination. Big fan of peer support. It has absolutely been a huge part of my adulthood and why I'm still here. And I think it's just, I really want to be here and honor folks who came before us. There's a lot of folks who died trying to tell the world about all of this, and I acknowledge that I have a unique way. We have a unique way to platform that, and that's something that is now allowed, and we're not going to be silenced and locked up for it. So I really want to acknowledge that history as well.
I appreciate all of that so much, resonate with it, and feel the same way, deeply, deeply, deeply. At the heart of this for me is this idea that each and every one of us, again, has the right to name, define, and interpret each and every one of our firsthand lived experiences and identities for ourselves. And each and every one of us has a responsibility to prevent and acknowledge the harm caused to ourselves and others across those three actions, right? In history now and forever moving forward, because simply put, that harm is rooted in the manipulating, co-opting, colonization of the understanding of what it is to have a human experience. Essentially, if I were to put sort of like my personal mission statement for my way of moving through the world as a person just on the planet and in the professional roles that I am privileged to have, is really to try and show everyone that I can possibly reach that they have pathways to exploring themselves and their relation to the world and others in it in ways that could hopefully, ideally, right, bring us all to inner and collective resonance and celebration. Because even beyond trauma and emotional distress and these types of lived experiences, there is so much under the realm of like neurodiversity. And again, like I resonate with the experience of madness, which is a whole rabbit hole spiel I could go on, right? But there are many elements of my experience that have been pathologized that I find are really magical and amazing and in line with my spirituality and spiritual sense of myself. And again, it's really just opening up access to informed consent, doorways to self-exploration and growth. And I think each and every one of us has a responsibility to doing that for ourselves in our own lives, and also supporting each other in that effort as a greater community as well. So I just so appreciate sharing this space with you, Max. For anyone listening, thank you. And please, 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 continue this conversation in your communities, in your work, in your lives, and continue exploring this for yourself as well.